Now, the rest of the story. Pete's group was finished. Pete knew it, the boys knew it. The only one who seemed uncertain on the subject was their agent, who now scrambled furiously to pick up the pieces from their latest and greatest failure. It had been a dream audition for Decca Records. Most singing groups never see the inside of a recording studio, much less a studio that prestigious. Pete's agent had said, look, this is the big leagues. Give them a variety, some standards, some of your own stuff, too. So Pete and the boys gratefully obeyed. It had been a long, cold 10 hours in the van driving to the big city that New Year's Eve. They even got lost in a blizzard along the way, and that night after reaching their destination, Pete's group wondered about sightseeing in the snow, but all they could think about was their audition the following day and the huge career that would inevitably result from it. Pete and the boys belted 15 songs in the allotted hour on New Year's Day. Hiding their nervousness as best they could, they sang The Sheik of Araby and September in the Rain, Red Sails in the Sunset, Until There Was You. And when the session was over, they left the studio more positive than ever that they were destined for greatness. The verdict from Decca Records came almost immediately thereafter, and the answer was no. For whatever reasons, too many to enumerate, among them no talent, no originality, and groups like this are on the way out. Pete and the boys were at once broken-hearted, and their agent said, don't worry, there must be a mistake. He was right, and they'd all made it together. And that's where you met Pete's agent, scrambling to pick up the pieces. He returned to Decca, demanded to meet with the head of the company's A&R department. He was shoved into a sales manager's office instead. You've got to reconsider my group, the agent pleaded. The answer was still no. Give my boys a contract and I'll personally buy 3,000 copies of their first single, the agent. The answer was still no. It was at that moment that the agent realized that where Pete and the boys were concerned, the answer would always be no. But he couldn't tell them, not yet. To make it look good, he must hit all of the other important recording companies first, Columbia, HMV, Phillips, Pye, and Pete's agent did. Yet everywhere he went, the answer was always the same, and the answer was no. The disappointment was too much even for Pete himself. He left the group, and the dream died. Almost. For once upon a time on the last day of December in 1961, 4 youngsters piled into a van and plowed through a heavy snowstorm for the privilege of being supremely disappointed. But now, whenever you hear one of their songs, you may picture them roaming the frigid city streets on the brink of disillusionment. In those times before drummer Pete Best bade them goodbye and made way for Ringo. That's right. Decca, Columbia, HMV, Phillips, Dye, all of those big-name recording companies unequivocally informed agent Brian Epstein that there was simply no future for a group called the Beatles. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Sometimes the transferred audio from Mr. Harvey's broadcasts wasn't the best quality, but these stories are too important to exclude. Now, can you imagine the Beatles not being a part of our musical world? In December of 1961, Beatles manager Brian Epstein met with Decca Records with positive results. On December 13, 1961, Decca A&R executive Mike Smith saw the Beatles perform here at the Cavern Club in Liverpool and was impressed by what he saw. Mike was so impressed that he asked Brian to bring the Beatles down to London to do a commercial test to determine their marketability. On that cold morning, January 1st, 1962, Neil Aspinall drove the Beatles from Liverpool to London. Until February of 1961, the Beatles, with Pete Best on drums, used public transportation to get to their shows. But in that February, the Beatles were playing 2 or 3 shows in different locations and needed their own transportation. To solve their transportation issues, Pete Best asked Neil to become their part-time road manager. Now, on a side note, Neil was having an affair with Pete Best's mother, Mona. They had a child, Vincent Rogue Best, who was born on July 21st, 1962. Neil denied that the child was his for decades, but he now acknowledges Rogue as being his child. Rogue created a Beatles museum in Liverpool called the Magical History Museum, and I plan to visit one day. Neil bought an old gray and maroon Comer van for £80 and charged each of the band members 5 shillings per concert. Neil drove the van. The Beatles took turns sitting on the single passenger seat, and the other 3 sat on the hard bench seat in the back. They often slept while Neil drove. The trip from Liverpool to London should have taken about 5 hours, but somehow Neil got lost and the trip took about 10 hours. The Beatles slept as well as they could on the drive down. According to John Lennon, they arrived just in time to see the drunks jumping in the Trafalgar Square fountain. Brian Epstein arrived by train. The Beatles arrived at the studio between 10 and 11 a.m. for the commercial test. Decca's Mike Smith, who was to head the commercial test, had rung in the new year and arrived late with a hangover. Now, at the time, a normal commercial test consisted of a band recording from 2 to 5 songs. Then the band was quickly ushered out of the building and told to await a phone call. The Beatles were in good form and recorded song after song, took a lunch break, and recorded more songs, 15 altogether. Most of the songs were done in a single take with no overdubs. The recordings were raw. If Decca offered the Beatles a record deal, the first album probably would have come from this recording session. After waiting what must have been the longest month of their lives, Decca executives finally contacted Brian. Decca ultimately rejected the Beatles because they felt, as Mr. Harvey explained, guitar groups were on the way out. According to the Beatles anthology, published in 2000, Decca executives said, "The Beatles have no future in show business." Wow! Now, on the same day as the Beatles commercial test, New Year's Day 1961, another band also recorded a commercial test for Decca. Decca ultimately decided against the Beatles and for the other group purportedly because they were a local band, which meant that travel expenses would be less. The other band was Brian Poole and the Tremolos. In 1963, they released 2 songs which became hits, Twist and Shout and Do You Love Me? In Mr. Harvey's broadcast, he mentioned that Pete Best left the band. He left the band, that's a fact, but not of his own volition. On August 16, 1962, after being with the Beatles for 2 years, Pete Best was fired and replaced by, of course, Ringo Starr, who was the drummer for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The reason behind Pete Best being fired has been a subject of debate ever since. Pete Best left the music industry in 1968 and worked in an unemployment office. He eventually became a supervisor and retired after having worked there for 20 years. In 1995, 33 years after being fired, Pete Best was finally financially rewarded for his time with the Beatles. In that year, the Beatles anthology was released. It consisted of 3 double albums, one which was released in late 1995 and the other 2 released in 1996. They also released a 3-part television documentary and a book which boosted CD sales. The Beatles sold more records in 1996 than any other single year to that point. 10 songs from the commercial test appeared on Anthology. Because Pete Best was the drummer for those 10 songs, he received millions of pounds in royalties. Now, estimates range from 4 million to 25 million pounds, but for the protection of himself and his family, Pete Best refused to allow the amount of his royalty payments to be disclosed. Pete Best eventually returned to the music industry. His band, the Pete Best Band, regularly tours the world. Pete shares the drumming with his younger brother Rogue. In 2008, the Pete Best Band released an album called Hayman's Green. The album cover features the picture of Pete Best's face that was removed from part of the collage designed for Beatles Anthology 1 album. In 2011, a street in Liverpool was named after the fired drummer. It's called Pete Best Drive. Like Pete Best, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr also tour the world separately, but there's little chance that Pete Best will be included in any future collaborations with Paul or Ringo. Do you have a favorite Beatles song, or do you have a favorite Beatle? I'm Brad Dyson. Thanks for watching, and as Paul Harvey would say, good day.